Okay, well then Saint so-and-so is wrong. And she said, well, he's a saint. I went, yeah, and he's still wrong, right? So saints can make mistakes. So I was kind of jotting down a list of some of these things that I might share with you before the show begins. One that just occurred to me while I was talking, it's not so much an error as it is an infelicity of expression. And you know, when I was coming into the Catholic faith, I read a lot of Church of Spirituality, mystical literature, and half the time I couldn't make heads or tails of it. I think I make more sense out of it now, having been Catholic for 20 years. But I used to think the problem lay entirely with me, that I was just too thick-headed to make any sense out of mystical literature. Then it struck me one day, after I had spent a lot of time thinking about the craft of writing, that some of them are just bad writers. Some of them are just bad writers. And I'll give you my prime example of this. Love the Saint, fantastic mystic, great spiritual counsel, terrible writer, Teresa of Avila. Her Interior Castle, Book of My Life, Way of Perfection, great mystical literature by Teresa of Avila. She wrote under obedience. She didn't have an outline. She didn't write consistently. And so you can pick up Teresa and she'll say things like, I'm going to talk about the virtue of hope. Then she'll turn around and talk about something completely different for 5 pages. Then all of a sudden she goes off on another theme. You have no idea where she's going. And then you'll hit another paragraph and it'll say, well, you know, I haven't picked up the manuscript in 3 months and I can't remember what I was saying, but this is what I want to talk about now. And so you're like, what is going on with this text? You know, and a great saint, wonderful spiritual advice, not always a good writer. Sometimes it's a matter of saints being taken out of context, making a statement that maybe has a kind of evocative grip to it, but if taken literally, I think could get you in trouble. So I'll give you a great example. One of my favorite quotes, I mean, I really appreciate the quote, is from Alphonsus Liguori. He said, he who prays will be saved, and he who doesn't pray will not be saved. Well, there's a point of view that you can take on that I think is perfectly intelligible. But if you take that quite literally, well, obviously you need more than prayer to be saved. You need charity, right? But you could take him out of context and misunderstand him. I think the same thing is true of Louis de Montfort. Obviously, a great Marian devotionalist who encourages people in that in our love of the Blessed Mother. But you could take de Montfort in some of his passages as saying, well, all you need is to be devoted to Mary and you'll be saved. But clearly that's not the case. You also need charity, right? So St. Augustine, my favorite of all the saints in the universe, was taken out of context by Cornelius Jansen, founder of the Jansenist movement, and run in some pretty dangerous directions. And so when I was a non-Catholic and I was reading about the 18th century Catholic history and I came across the Pope's bull Unigenitus condemning Jansenism, I was reading through the condemnations and I said, wait a minute, the Pope's condemning Augustine. And I actually had to call up Scott Hahn one day before I was Catholic. I said, Dr. Hahn, what's going on with Unigenitus? How is he condemning this passage out of Augustine? And he says, no, you don't understand. He's not condemning Augustine. He's condemning the use that Jansen made of that particular quotation. So it's very contextual. And I went, oh, okay, there's a lot I need to learn about how you actually do Catholic theology. Taken out of context, I was getting myself into big trouble. And then here's another one that always fascinates me. Evagrius Ponticus, 4th century Egyptian theologian, monastic theologian, who had a method of combating temptations that he learned from Stoicism, and it involved say if you had the temptation to pride, you would, in his mind, you would throw up against it the temptation to lust as a way of kind of combating pride, letting you know you weren't all that great stuff after all. And obviously, there's a way of maybe reflecting on the weakness of your flesh that could combat your pride. There's another way you could do that could lead you in the sin of lust, right? So again, context, discretion, prudence is the key to interpreting all these guys, which is just an argument against being a fundamentalist when it comes to reading the saints or any theological literature. You don't just necessarily take them literally in their straightforward denotative sense. Have to have an understanding of the person and the context to make sense of them. All right, so enough of that. We'll see you back in a few minutes after this break. 1-833-288-3986.
Join Archbishop Jose Gomez in sharing the good news.
Mercy is the heart of God, and mercy is the name of God. In Jesus, God's mercy becomes a man. the child born in a mother's womb who comes to share our human lives, our joys and sorrows. Jesus commands us to practice God's love and mercy. We discover the mercy of God by doing mercy in our own lives, making little sacrifices in our daily lives, always looking for little ways to be more generous. Just maybe an act of kindness, maybe just listening to somebody, maybe forgiving somebody who has done something to us.
Visit lacatholics.org to find ways to connect with our faith community in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles.
The most original and exclusive Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.
I don't like looking back. I prefer to look forward and keep moving forward. There's plenty to cover. I do a lot of research and try to dig out the bits and pieces of a life or of an agenda that people don't want to talk about.
The World Over with Raymond Arroyo. Tonight, 8 Eastern on EWTN Radio and Television.
All right, welcome back to Call to Communion. I'm your host, Dr. David Anders, and the number to be on the show is 1-833-288-3986. So at the moment, I have completely open phone lines. I don't seem to have any calls in the hopper right now being screened, so unless Matt's got something going I don't know about. So I would encourage you to call with your outlandish, never had the guts to ask this question, because we need you to call 1-833-288-3986. 1-833-288-3986. Whatever's stopping you from becoming Catholic. What's stopping your mailman from becoming a Catholic? What's stopping your great uncle's second cousin twice removed from becoming a Catholic? Call me and tell me about it at 1-833-288-3986. In the meanwhile, here's another question from a listener. This one from Mylene in Montreal. She says, "Hi, Mr. Price and Dr. Anders. Who created hell?" I love listening to your show, and I really appreciate your program. Thanks so much, Mylene. I appreciate the question. So here's the Catholic doctrine. Anything that exists other than God was created by God. Anything that exists other than God was created by God. Now, when it comes to the question of hell, I myself am a little bit in doubt on this one. Should we consider hell to have a substantial existence? Like, does it exist as a substance? Okay, and what I mean by that is a thing that has its own kind of integral nature, sort of has defined properties in an essence. Is hell that kind of thing? Or is hell more the word we use to describe the existential state of creatures who remain permanently alienated from God? And not thinking of them so much as being circumscribed in a place, having the concept of hell as, sort of like a prison cage or something, and then you have to imagine walls and bars and, maybe a jailer, that sort of image. Then, of course, you'd have to talk about a sort of positive substances that would be the object of a creative act. But if it's just an existential state, then we would be thinking more in terms of God creating and sustaining the rational agents who remain locked in that existential condition, if you see the distinction that I'm drawing. But in any event, however you conceive of it, whether as a thing in itself or merely existential state, insofar as anything exists other than God, that thing was created by God, according to Catholic doctrine. So thanks for the question. All right, 1-833-288-3986. Aha! So now the calls are starting to come in. I appreciate it. Are we ready with Sam? Okay, let's go to Sam in Duluth, Minnesota. I had the longest trip of my life into Duluth, Minnesota. I did an event up there for Real Presence Radio years ago, and I flew from Birmingham, I think, to Atlanta, to Minneapolis, St. Paul, to Duluth. So I changed planes all those times. We got planes flying in. We're like 3 feet off the runway, and then the plane takes off again. They wouldn't let us land because of the fog. They directed us all the way to Grand Forks, North Dakota, land in Grand Forks. Here comes a blizzard. They said, if we don't get off the ground in 30 minutes, we're stranded in Grand Forks. So I'm desperately calling, trying to figure out if I can catch a ride from North Dakota to Minneapolis, to Duluth, take off from Grand Forks, fly back to Minneapolis, get stranded, rent a car at usurious and exorbitant prices, drive to Duluth, and show up with like 5 minutes to spare before my talk. I think it took me 24 hours to get there from Birmingham. Then the same thing happened on the way back. What a trip. But had a great time when I was there. Wonderful folks in Duluth. Sorry for that diversion. Sam, thanks from Duluth. Thanks for calling. What can I do for you?
Thank you, Dr. Anders. It's a pleasure, and you are saving souls day by day, which is much appreciated all over the world. Firstly, maybe we could come pick you up anywhere you are, and you could come and offer us some live apologetics in the near future.
Fantastic.
It would help us greatly. Yes. The question is, I'm trying to marry a woman, and I'm a Catholic revert of late, and she is a Christian, not really into the church and its teaching, or picking up as much as I'm seeking. And I'm curious as to this questionnaire, which asks, about, do you vow that you won't try to scandalize the church or be a scandal to the church in your relations and things, whereby I was kind of struck and wondered, has she scandalized herself enough? Are we really, as Christians, trying to do the right thing in the wrong if she doesn't become Catholic? Or how could I ever convince someone, or could the church convince someone in that much doubt?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So first of all, with respect to the question of scandal, I mean that's kind of an open-ended question. I mean, the church clearly allows for the marriage between Catholics and non-Catholics, and such arrangements can be an occasion for scandal. So, for example, let's say a Catholic marries a non-Catholic, and because of the non-Catholic, ends up neglecting his Catholic obligations to Mass or to support the works of the church, or to any aspect of his Catholic identity. He waters it down, perhaps, out of a kind of misplaced deference to the non-Catholic spouse. Well, that could be an occasion of scandal, to be sure. Or the non-Catholic spouse might make moral demands upon the Catholic party, say, in relationship to questions of human sexuality within the bonds of matrimony. And that's often an area where Catholics and non-Catholics don't see eye to eye. And so there are definitely occasions where scandal could happen, but they're not inevitable. They're not inevitable. And it's not intrinsically scandalous for a Catholic to marry a non-Catholic. In fact, some of the most celebrated conversions in the history of the church have been through these kinds of mixed marriages. The first Catholic king of France, Clovis, was a pagan married to a Catholic princess, and he went on to become a Catholic king and the progenitor of all those guys named Louis, down to Louis the 18th or whatever we left off with the Louis was in France. So it can be, and that's actually the most common reason for becoming Catholic. If you take a poll of RCIA members, 2/3 of them across North America are coming into the church because of marriages or family relationships of some kind. So, yeah, I mean, it can work the other way. Now, your second question was, what could you say, or what could the church do to persuade your fiancé to become Catholic? Well, so I would look at it differently. Instead of saying, what can I do? Give me the formula that will infallibly ensure her conversion to Catholicism. Wrong question. You can't do that, because faith is a gift, and you can't compel her by any kind of force of logic. In fact, the First Vatican Council taught, this is a dogmatic fact, that there is no truth accessible to reason that necessarily and intrinsically compels the consent of the will to the truth of Catholic dogma. So there are reasons, there are motives of credibility, there are arguments that can render the act of faith rational, but the Catholicism as a whole cannot be compelled by any particular historical reason. All right? And to attempt to do that is to attempt to square the circle, basically. I mean, the only way you can do that is to resort to manipulative tactics that are intrinsically dehumanizing and exploitive, and we don't want to do that. So what you do instead is you say, how can I best help my spouse to advance in the life of virtue and holiness? And the church has a beautiful doctrine of moral gradualism, whereby you do not have to climb the mountain in one day. You take incremental steps in the direction of the true, the good, and the beautiful, and any incremental step you take in that direction is a step worth taking. And so you leave your wife's conscience or your fiance's conscience intact, and you respect it, and then you simply take the integral steps that you can. And look, you can advance in the life of virtue Of course, Catholic faith is the most efficacious way of doing that, but you can advance in specific virtues without reference to explicit Catholicism as such. You can work on justice and truth and courage and fidelity and temperance and all the rest of it, using the tools that are available to her within her own tradition, and they can become a point of contact and commonality between the two of you, and hopefully the generosity of spirit and the open-mindedness and the rationality and the virtue of your own Catholic faith will be intrinsically attractive to her, and she may, eventually come to your faith on her own terms, or she may not. She may not. But you need to think these things through at the beginning, which is what you're doing now, and that's good, and have conversations about the dignity of your conscience, the dignity of hers, and come to an arrangement so how you can live your Christian faith together with as little friction as possible, as much commonality as possible, respecting the dignity of one another's conscience. So I hope that's helpful to you, and I appreciate the call. Thanks for calling. The number to be on the show again is 1-833-288-3986. Let's see. Next one up would be, can we go to Carter in Mobile? Let's go to Carter in Mobile. Carter, welcome to Call to Communion.
Thank you so much for all that you do. I truly love your show. I'm a new Catholic. I was recently, last year I was received in the church. My question relates to the deposit of faith. With over 10,000 different Bible translations, why doesn't the Catholic Church have a patent on the Bible? Or if they do endorse the World Council of Churches, why do they pay a royalty rather than just stick to what is theirs?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So what's copyrightable is not the Bible. Bible's public domain. You can copyright a contemporary translation because that's the work of a particular scholar. If I sit down and translate the Bible myself, my own blood, sweat, and tears go into that project, that's my intellectual property, not the text, not the underlying text, not the Bible, but the translation is my intellectual property. And so that can be copyrighted, and it's, what is I don't know, copyright law in America is, 70 years plus life of author, something like that. The Catholic Church in North America does have a copyright on a translation. The New American Bible is copyrighted to the U.S. Council of the USCCB, the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops. But there are other translations that are, of course, not licensed to not copyrighted by the USCCB. And if a Catholic institution wanted to use those in a public context, they'd have to pay the licensing fee, and you would make that choice. That'd be a prudential choice if you thought a particular translation was more felicitous given your, social historical context. So that's why you would do it. There's nothing stopping a group of scholars or churchmen or ecclesiastics from producing an original translation and then offering it for free in the public domain. A person could do that, to be sure. So if you have that talent out there, guys, and you want to make a public domain translation, have at it. Now, there are public domain translations that have passed beyond copyright laws, and some of them have been produced by Catholic Church. So the Douay Rheims, for example, is quite an old English translation of the Bible based on the Vulgate from the 16th century, is public domain, but it was produced by the Catholic faith. So I hope that answers the question. All right, thank you. The number to be on the show is 1-833-288-3986, 1-833-288-3986. Let's go now to Sue in North Dakota. Sue, welcome to Call to Communion.
Thank you. I was wondering if the church teaches that Satan can read your thoughts.
Thank you. I really appreciate the question. The church does not teach that the devil can read your thoughts. And the opinion of most Catholic theologians, I'm not aware that this has ever been pronounced as a dogma, but it does seem to be the common opinion of theologians and seems to be confirmed by spiritual writers and exorcists and the like, is that the devil cannot read your thoughts, but that he is a very good neuroscientist and cognitive scientist. And so he's a keen observer of the human condition and can influence human thought and behavior without actually being able to read your thoughts. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, lived 800 years ago. He lived long before modern neuroscience, and so he's operating with a faulty psychology and a faulty neurology. He still believes in the theory of the four humors, for example, but I think his speculations about demonic influence are instructive, and they could be translated into a different kind of scientific idiom. So Thomas's belief was that the devil could influence physical matter, and since the humors are physical property of the human person, the devil could, as it were, kind of push and pull on the swirl and wave of sort of the human physiology in a way that could excite the passions. And if you analogously, if you imagine, you take away the humors and you think in terms of say neurotransmitters, that sort of thing, Thomas, I think today would say, yeah, the devil can could push and prod you in a way to suggest certain passions, certain responses, certain emotional reactions, and he knows might know your personal history and this sort of thing, so he could influence you, and then might be able to draw some rational inferences about the kinds of things that you're likely thinking, based on past experience, but it wouldn't be the same thing as mind reading. All right, I appreciate the question, Sue. Thank you so much. Number to be on the show is 1-833-288-3986, 1-833-288-3986. All right, let's go now to Mary in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Mary, welcome to Call to Communion.
Hi, I tuned in just a few minutes late, so I'm enjoying you taking the place of Mr. Price. But that said, I recently befriended a woman very recently, and we were talking about religion. She is Orthodox Jew. And she actually left the Orthodox part of her Judaism, and she asked me if she could go to church with me. And so I would like to take her. I don't want to screw it up because I want to respect her faith. So I'd like your advice. What would you do?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So that's an interesting one. It's a little bit touchy, and I'd have to know the woman, and I'd have to know your diocese in order to give a really informed answer. Obviously, the church vigorously condemns anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. That hasn't prevented it from rearing its ugly head even still today in a few circles. And so, if I had knowledge that a particular cleric had any kind of anti-Semitic tendencies, I would definitely want to steer away from that cleric, to be sure. At the same time, I think I would try to select what is likely to be an aesthetically very beautiful liturgy. I don't know how far you are from the cathedral in your diocese, but very often the cathedral liturgy is, they usually have a pretty good organist and, very beautiful music and pageantry, and that might be approachable. So those are some thoughts right off the top.
Each weekday, we'll dive into the timeless teachings of our Catholic faith, drawing upon the wisdom of the ages to navigate the challenges of today. Together, we'll seek truth, find inspiration, and forge a deeper connection with God. I'm Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers, and I invite you to join me for Beacon of Truth, today at 4 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
This is Father John Trigilio. We need Catholic radio because it is a lifeline to Holy Mother Church. Catholic radio enables us to know what the Church teaches, but also to have solidarity with one another. It is one way that we express our commonality, our communio, that we are family, and by staying together, we can be God's children here on earth.
The world needs EWTN Catholic Radio, now more than ever.
Journey deeper in your understanding of the Eucharistic mystery and the Eucharistic story of God's love for us. Download the free ebook, The 12 Stations of the Most Holy Eucharist, at EWTN.com/Catholicism.
The most original Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.
Hey, this is Michael O'Neill, the Miracle Hunter. Join us this week as Monsignor David LaPuma and David Kirsten join to discuss Venerable Nelson Baker. Also, a conversation on Marian apparitions with author Catherine Odell.
The Miracle Hunter with Michael O'Neill. Saturday afternoon, 1 Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Hi, this is Cy Kellett. Later today on Catholic Answers Live, 2 hours with Jimmy Aiken, Open Forum. Catholic Answers Live, 6 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio. Now, back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Hammer.
Welcome back to Call to Communion. I'm your host, David Anders. The number to be on the show was 1-833-288-3986. Normally, I'm joined by my facilitator and good friend Tom Price, but he's off gallivanting in Priceland today, so I'm not sure what he's up to, but he's not around, so I'm all by myself, all by my lonesome, and I miss him dearly, so pray for the safe return of Tom Price. Outside North America, you can dial 205-271-2985, and again, the main line is 1-833-288-3986. We welcome your calls in answer to the question, what's stopping you, your relative, the dog catcher on your street, or anybody else you know from becoming a Catholic? 1-833-288-3986. Let's go now to Karen in Frisco, Texas. Karen, welcome to Call to Communion.
Hi, Dr. Anders. Thank you so much. I appreciate your show very much.
Thank you.
And my question today is, what am I supposed to do with sins of omission?
Yeah, not commit them. Not commit them.
What is committing that's something that you don't do?
Yeah, sure, exactly. So there are duties of our states of life. So let me give you a really great example. If a man is ordained to the sacred priesthood, for example, he has a duty to say Holy Mass, right? And he may have a duty assigned to him by his bishop to say Holy Mass in a particular place. He also has a duty to, say, pray the Liturgy of the Hours, several times a day. These are duties imposed by his state of life. So let's say, said priest wakes up one morning and he says, I'm not going to do morning prayer because, I'd rather play a round of golf. And then, he looks at his watch and says, Mass is supposed to start in 15 minutes, but, I've only made it to the 16th hole and I'm shooting a pretty good game. I'm just going to let it slide today and call in sick. And, Father help me out can take the Mass instead of me, and I'm going to skip out. He's not doing what he's supposed to be doing, right? That would be a sin for that priest to do that. St. Paul says someplace that the man who doesn't support his family is worse than an infidel. My father used to quote that text to me all the time. He rarely quoted Scripture, but he quoted that one, So husband says, I just got my paycheck, biweekly check from, down at wherever that I work, and I could go home and pay my child's Catholic school tuition and, give some money to my wife to buy groceries or whatever else she needs to do. But instead, I think I'm going to go play the slots. I'm going to go with my buddies down to Vegas and play the slots. That's a sin of omission. He has an obligation to care for his family. He's omitting that. And if it's the duties imposed by our state of life, all right? Let's say you're a Catholic contemplative. You've made a commitment to the contemplative way of life. Maybe you're a cloistered religious. And so you have a moral duty to commit yourself to the life of prayer and contemplation. But you decide instead to spend all day playing World of Warcraft, right? That would be a sin of omission. Is that helpful?
That's very helpful. Thank you so much.
All right, no problems. Thank you for calling. The number to be on the show, 1-833-288-3986, 1-833-288-3986. Let's go now to Michael in Gladstone, Oregon. Michael, welcome to Call to Communion.
Thank you, Dr. Anders. God bless you for doing what you do. I have been reading the Acts of the Apostles, and I have noticed in there, for some reason, I guess I've been unaware of this, how many miracles the various disciples performed, and in situations where they would, lay the hands on people and tongues of fire would come down. They would cure leprosy, evil spirits, and in some cases raise the dead. When did all that stop?
Yeah.
And when it did stop, did this become a crisis for the people in the faith? Because there must have been people that say, oh, hey, I remember when Eutychus fell out of the window, and they went out and they raised him up, and he was dead. And how come that's not happening anymore?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate the question. So the question of the cessation of miracles is a point of contention between the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. And it was made a point of contention because in the 16th century, Catholic polemicists were very well aware of the fact that Protestants were preaching a different doctrine, and they said, look, when Christ sent the apostles out, he confirmed their message with miracles. you guys are making radical claims about totally reconfiguring the way the Christian faith is lived and expressed in the world, different from what Holy Mother Church has done for centuries. Don't you think, if such a great upheaval were intended by God, that he would confirm it by miracles? And, of course, Luther did no miracles. Calvin did no miracles. Zwingli and Cranmer did no miracles. And they knew they did no miracles. And so this was the Protestant answer. We don't need no stinking miracles, right? Because we're preaching the faith once for all delivered to the saints. We're preaching the same faith that was in fact confirmed by miracles in the first century. And God doesn't need to do contemporary miracles in order to confirm our message. That was the Protestant position. That position became hardened in the 19th century by fundamentalists such as B.B. Warfield of Princeton Theological Seminary, in contradistinction to what theologians at the time called enthusiasm. That's a technical term in Protestant theology that refers to particular sects. There were groups of Christians running around that were claiming to perform miracles and to speak in tongues and to dream dreams and have visions. And a lot of times those manifestations were frenetic and highly emotional and tended to fanaticism. And the more staid and sober university Presbyterian types like Warfield opposed quote-unquote enthusiasm, and they doubled down and wrote books about it and confirmed and made it a point of dogma, not just that God had stopped doing miracles just as a kind of sort of as an accidental fact, but that was in fact essential to the nature of the contemporary gospel proclamation that it not be confirmed by miracles, because we weren't the kind of ecstatic visionaries and contortionists that they were criticizing in the quote-unquote enthusiast movements. All right, so cessationism, that is the technical term for that doctrinal position, became a central claim of some forms of fundamentalist Christianity, cessationism. The Catholic Church, however, has never subscribed to cessationism, has always maintained the contemporary relevance and reality of miracles. And so, for example, one of the criteria for canonization, for elevating a saint to the altar, a person of holiness to the altar and declaring them to be a saint, is documentable miracles that have occurred as a result of that saint's intercession. And you can read the reports, and they're 99 times out of 100, they are claims of medical miracles, cures that defy rational explanation, and certified by physicians who are experts in the field of whatever that particular disease or ailment is, that says there's no known natural mechanism that could bring this about, and this must have been a miraculous healing. And so we have copious contemporary accounts of miracles, and when you read the lives of the saints throughout the centuries, they are, of course, replete with claims of the miraculous. So, go read Bonaventure's Life of Francis, for example, and you will be impressed by the plethora of miracles ascribed to the little man from Assisi. Now, having said that, I confess that I personally in my life have never witnessed a miracle. Now, don't get me wrong, I didn't say I've never seen an answered prayer. And when I make those kind of claims on the air, sometimes somebody will call in and go, well, I've seen a miracle. My husband was a pagan for 68 years, and no one ever thought he would convert to the Catholic faith. And then, we prayed a rosary and he converted, right? Well, that may be supernatural, but it's not the technical definition of a miracle, which is a sensible phenomenon that is a kind of wonder that defies any rational explanation. Whereas, things like, dramatic conversions may have a supernatural influence, but they don't qualify the empirical test of miracles. One of the most orthodox and holiest and kindest priests I ever knew was a man named Lambert Greenan, who died at the age of 101, and he was a Dominican for over 85 years, became a Dominican when he was 16 years old. Once I asked Father Lambert, I said, Father Lambert, have you ever seen a miracle? He thought about it for a second. He said, no. Nope, don't think I have. I said, you ever had a doubt? He said, no, not for a second. So the Catholic position is that miracles do exist, but they're rare. They're rare. And so there you have it. That's the position. Anyway, the number to be on the show is 1-833-288-3986. I read an interesting book one time by a Pentecostal theologian named John Ruthven, Ruthven. I don't necessarily recommend his theology because it's not Catholic, but he wrote a doctoral dissertation critiquing the cessationism of B.B. Warfield. And I read that probably 20 years ago when I was in grad school. So anybody who's interested in sort of inter-Protestant polemics on the question of cessationism, Ruthven's book is an interesting academic study trying to undermine Warfield's conclusions, for whatever that's worth. Written from a Pentecostal point of view. All right, number to be on the show, 1-833-288-3986. Let's go now to, let's see, who's next in line? This would be Chris in Cleveland, Ohio. Chris, welcome to Call to Communion.
Hi, thank you. I've recently read, I'm a convert, and that Catholics should know the Magnificat of Mary, the Act of Contrition, and Psalm 51. So for Lent, I thought I'm going to practice Psalm 51. But I have questions on understanding what some of the verses mean, particularly verse 5, Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. That just sounds bad. And in 8, let the bones which you have broken rejoice. And then the last few is at the very end, where it says, O Lord, you take no delight in sacrifice. And it goes on, you would not be pleased. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit. So why do we sacrifice at Lent? It confuses me.
Sure. Yep, let me address all these. Let me do the last one first. So the sacrifice that David speaks of when he says, sacrifice and offering you do not desire, he is specifically talking about the sacrifice of goats and bulls and sheep and oxen offered in the temple in Jerusalem, the bloody sacrifice of animal victims. And this is a constant theme of the prophets. Although God commanded animal sacrifice of the Israelites, he simultaneously tells them that he has no need of it. And he owns all the cattle on 1,000 hills, so what difference does it make to him if you give him another one, right? It's just that he doesn't have any intrinsic pleasure in that. He's certainly not he's not feasting on slaughtered animals, nor is he propitiated by their blood. All that is, he has no need of that stuff. And so the conclusion that you draw, the proper theological conclusion, is that why then would God command sacrifice? And the answer is that the significance of that kind of sacrifice, the sacrifice of, say, goats and bulls, is that the worshiper is giving up something of value. And so it's a token of his sincerity. Because what God cares about is the relationship of one's heart. That's why he says, sacrifice and offering you do not desire, but a contrite heart you will not despise. Genuine penitence, the kind that turn from evil and do good, as opposed, say, to the man who exploits his employees or abuses his wife and then makes a show of his piety by offering 100 bulls on an altar, though he hasn't actually fundamentally changed his way of life. That's the kind of thing that the prophets are critiquing. And so in the Catholic life, the purpose of offering sacrifice, especially the sacrifice of the Mass, but even things like sacrifices that we might make for Lent, they're always with an eye to the transformation of our inner life, our interior life, that we become people who are humble and contrite and penitent and hungering and thirsting for righteousness. And if the sacrifices that we perform don't have that effect, if, for example, Jesus criticizes those who give alms in order to be seen by men, right? If our motive is just to make a show of ourselves, to make a kind of spectacle, then our motives are far from what God desires, and they have no value. But if we give 2 cents out of the proper motive, then that's far more valuable than giving $200 million out of vanity. Does that make sense?
It does. It's very clear.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. All right, the number to be on the show, 1-833-288-3986. 1-833-288-3986. Let's go now to Bernadette in Columbus, Ohio. Bernadette, welcome to Call to Communion.
Hi, thank you. I was recently engaging in some discourse with somebody about abortion, and they came back with St. Hildegard von Bingen performed chemical abortions. I wanted to know, how is that permissible
It
by
isn't.
the Catholic Church.
It isn't. It's not. So abortion has been understood to be a grave moral evil from the very first century. And so, one of the earliest Christian writings to comment on it was the Didache, which is a document that was produced either in the first or early second century, and it specifically condemns abortion. Abortion has been, anytime the question has ever been raised in the history of Catholic moral theology, it's always regarded as a gross and terrible evil. And so I'm not sure what the claim is about Hildegard of Bingen, but I guarantee you that the clerical censors who undertook her cause know very well the history of her life and are she wouldn't have been elevated to the altar. I can assure you that if the church were persuaded for half a second that she had engaged in intentional chemical abortion. So I mean, there's probably some story there. I don't know what it is. I can't go into the details, but it certainly wouldn't rise to the level that anyone investigating her case would come to that conclusion. So, it's not uncommon at all. History is used polemically all the time by partisans, and all alternative histories and dissenting histories are always kind of trying to dig through documents and come up with wild theories to impugn or an historical figure. I mean, take an example, and this is one to know something about when John Henry Cardinal Newman was being considered for canonization, and he succeeded. He was in fact canonized. He's Saint John Henry Newman now. There were several people in the media that made the claim that Newman was a closeted homosexual, and they based that argument on the fact that Newman had a very close personal friend, very, very close personal and intimate friend, with whom he wanted to be buried. When he died, he wanted them to be in the same grave. And so there was a story that circulated in the media that homoeroticism could be the only possible explanation for that. And so it started getting carried about. There was an urban legend that Newman was a homosexual. Well, you can read Kerr's biography of Newman, and he puts that urban legend to death with a 1,000 arrows. There's absolutely no truth in it. That kind of thing happens in the hagiography and what you might call the anti-hagiography of Catholic saints all the time. I don't know the one about Hildegard of Bingen, but if I've looked into it, I'm pretty confident that there's no basis to that. All right, thanks for the call. The number to be on the show is 1-833-288-3986. Let us go to Tony in Los Angeles, California. Tony, welcome to Call to Communion.
Hi, Dr. Anders. I have a quick question about St. Augustine. I was reading a book and some other material. So Jesus was a Jew is one of them, and in there they basically talk about how St. Augustine talks about how basically the Jews were deprived of their kingdom and all of that because they didn't believe in Jesus. Well, my first question is, isn't this a concept that's from the Torah, from the Old Testament? And then my other question is, the same logic was used whenever the Europeans lost the war against, Islam, let's say. It was the same logic. They lost because they were being chastised. And so my question is, how is it that St. Augustine gets he's so accused of anti-Semitism when the same concept is found in the Torah, and other Jews, I've come across other rabbis who believe the same thing. So how is it that St. Augustine is accused of anti-Semitism? I don't understand.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So we need to draw a distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. Anti-Judaism is an animus against the Jewish religion. Anti-Semitism is a very spurious racial theory that there is a distinct ethnicity that one might call Semitic, and this, of course, we associate with 19th and 20th century fascism, particularly the National Socialists in Germany, but others as well, that tried to not just impugn Jewish religion, Jewish practice, but the idea that that there was some sort of distinctly Jewish ethnicity that had congenital features that rendered the Jew as such as some kind of hateful creature and a kind of infection that needed to be extirpated from humanity. And of course, that's what inspired Hitler's horrific so-called final solution. And there's no doubt that anti-Judaism, that the history of anti-Judaism in Christian society aided and abetted and fomented what would eventually become anti-Semitism, but they are conceptually distinct, all right? And so what you find in most of the church fathers, and not just Augustine, and this is unfortunately the case, but it is the case, is you do find a fairly pronounced anti-Judaism, that there is a palpable polemic against Judaism that is not always, it's not just good faith debate about religious differences, but there's a lot of invective that's used and a lot of demeaning and derogatory language. And that would be true of Augustine as well as Chrysostom and others of the fathers. And, we really don't have, there's really not a defense for that. I'm certainly not interested in defending them. I don't concede their position, and the church today doesn't concede their position. And the best we can do is to chalk it up to say that they were men of their time. And if you read any kind of polemical literature from antiquity, and not just Christian polemical literature, you will note that kind of invective is ubiquitous. I mean, like when people engage their polemical rivals in antiquity, it's ruthlessly, and it's always going for the jugular. And that was true when Christians wrote against Jews, and when non-Christians wrote against Christians, when X wrote against Y. It was always this kind of vicious battle to the death, and stereotyping and invective and narrow-minded bigotry. That was an unfortunate feature of the intellectual culture of the day, and Christians were not immune to it. As to why Christian authors might be singled out, I think, for a particular attack, and other bigoted authors may be left unmolested by posterity, well, I think it's because the Catholic Church, is a very big and prominent cultural target. And the logic of a lot of multicultural narrative is that, it's the narrative of the oppressor versus the oppressed. And so since, Christianity is the 800-pound gorilla of Western history, those that are typically perceived to be in the oppressed class rather than the oppressor class are the ones that get a pass in historical writing, and Christianity never seems to get a pass in that regard for the same reason. At least that's the way I would read the story. But appreciate the call. Thank you very much. The number to be on the show is 1-833-288-3986. Let us go now to Joe in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Joe, welcome to Call to Communion.
Hi, yeah. Thank you so much for taking my question. I read a book called Why God, Why Jesus, Why the Catholic Church recently, and in the book it says, refers to the church as Jesus' body. Like when Paul was knocked off the horse, Jesus appeared to him and said, "Why do you persecute me?" But you also hear the church being called the mother, and I'm just curious, like what's is it both? Is it one? Is it both or is it one?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. It is, of course, both, and they are not the only two metaphors that you find in the tradition to describe the church. Another common metaphor applied to the church is that the church is a boat. The bark of Peter you'll sometimes hear, and that, of course, is a reference to 1 Peter chapter 3, when the church and baptism are compared to the Ark of Noah, right? They carried the few through the waves, and of course the church does that through the vagaries of human sin and all the rest of it in culture. So there are a lot of different metaphors. The church is also a light. Second Vatican Council referred to the church as the light of the nations, Lumen Gentium, and we could come up with other metaphors as well. But the metaphor of the body of Christ is a special one, and it's more than a metaphor. The boat and these kinds of, they're clearly metaphors, but the body of Christ is a little bit more than a metaphor. And it seems in the mind of the Apostle Paul that the identification of the Christian with Christ is quite real, although mystical, i.e. in a way that escapes our rational understanding. That in baptism we die with Christ and are raised with him in more than a symbolic way, that there is a real ontological change in the nature of the human person, that there is a mark placed upon the soul that is ineradicable, such that wherever you go, Christ goes with you. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul makes the very arresting claim that Christians should not participate in prostitution, because if they do, they will unite the body of Christ to a prostitute. And the realism of that is shocking in its vulgarity and realism, that there is something so closely identified between the physical person of a Christian and Jesus Christ, that the members of Christ could be implicated in sin in that way. That's the reason Paul says you should never do that kind of thing. It also undergirds the Catholic devotion to the relics of the saints, that we believe that in venerating the relics of saints, we are literally venerating Christ and his members. So there's something special about the metaphor of the body of Christ that transcends those other metaphors. But thanks for the question. So there's a lot of people that are still on hold. Today's an unusual day because I'm actually here for another hour. If you guys want to hang on for 5 minutes, I'm actually going to host EWTN's Open Line with a call-in show for non-Catholics. So you could consider it Open Line or like Call to Communion Part 2. So if you want to hang on for 5 minutes, I'll be right back with EWTN's Open Line.
Well, as we head into the Lenten season, Catholics coast to coast